So thanks for taking your time for participating here. I uh, I just know Wim for many years, and he said there's this great guy. He's fantastic for your podcast. So I didn't have any doubts that this should be a perfect match if Wim says so. By the way, how do you know each other?
So when it's a little roundabout. My daughter's best friend works for him, and she told him about me that I was a doctor and 9/11 and all, and a little two degrees removed, but we all connected.
Right. Oh, whoa, great. Small world.
Yeah, small world.
Yeah. Um, I'm based in Riga, Latvia. I'm not sure if you've been in this part of the world.
No, I really want to go. I really want to visit.
It's pretty nice. It's
Yeah,
pretty nice.
I've heard it's beautiful. Yeah.
So if you're anytime in Riga, so let me know and I'll be happy to show you around.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, I think we're planning to go next year for sure.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, no, I'm serious. I really want to go see that whole area. We were just in Scandinavia this summer, and next stop is the Baltics and where you are.
Mm. So do you have any impressions about or expectations about this region?
I've read a fair amount of the history. I know some, I mean, I know a fair amount for an American, I think.
Mm.
I've always been intrigued by history and the wars and all the all the turmoil that the whole region has had over the years.
Mm. Mm. Great, great,
You've
fantastic.
been through your country has been through a lot.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Um, I've read on LinkedIn that you're retired now. Is that true?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So I guess we have an hour or so for the conversation. Let's see how it goes and just
Sure.
go with the flow.
Absolutely.
All right.
It's great to meet you, Jan.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. I'll start recording then. I have actually, but I definitely will cut the chit chat part.
Okay.
All
Yeah,
right.
give me 1 second. Let me just stabilize my computer here. Perfect. Okay.
Okay. By the way, how do you pronounce your surname correctly?
Dajer.
Dajer.
It's a Spanish J.
All right.
Yeah.
So perfect.
Confusing.
No problem. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tech Stories next episode, number 83 already. My guest today is Tony Dajer. We are going to talk about leadership in emergency times. And I was suggested to speak with Tony just because Tony was a doctor in emergency department and I understand the emergency department director from New York. And Tony was ER doctor in the closest hospital to the World Trade Center during 9/11 terrorist attacks. So I also read an article by the New Yorker about Tony and his leadership lessons in crisis situations that was related not only to 9/11 attacks, but also to COVID situation. So interesting story. I thought I would be very interested to talk with you, and thanks, Tony, for your time.
Oh, thank you, Jan. It's great to be here with you.
It's interesting, by the way, that we agreed on the details of this podcast exactly on 9/11, exactly 24 years after. So
Yes.
probably it's a coincidence, but would you please tell more us and our listeners in Eastern Europe about yourself and your experiences there?
Sure. I was born in New York City. I grew up in Puerto Rico, but I always went back to New York for summers to be with my grandparents. And I watched the towers go up again, this is my own personal history, is very tied to Lower Manhattan. I became a physician after attending medical school in New York City as well. When I came back to the city after residency, I started as an ER doctor in Lower Manhattan, at the smallest hospital in Manhattan, actually. It's a small community hospital about 5 blocks from the World Trade Center. So that was I was there off and on in the 90s because I lived in Europe for 5 years, and my wife is French, so we came to France. I went back to New York in 1999 and then became the assistant medical director of the emergency department. So on 9/11, but a little background on that actually, we had gone back to the city in the early 90s, and as it happened by coincidence, this seems to be some kind of fate. I was working at another hospital in Lower Manhattan, at a larger one called St. Vincent's, when we first got back after traveling and working in other parts of the country. So I went back to New York City. I'm backtracking a bit. In 1991, but in 1993, the first attack on the World Trade Center occurred. It's often been forgotten that the 9/11 was the second attack on the towers, and that was in February of 1993. And as it happened, I was on duty at the other hospital on that day as well. So I was on duty both times the World Trade Center was attacked, purely by coincidence. But I was only a doctor. I was not a director at the time. But I remember we had a large amount of patients, and I remember thinking I was in a back room treating dozens and dozens of patients. There were a lot of smoke inhalation injuries. People fell going down the stairs. There were hundreds of people that were casualties but not killed. There were 6 people killed during that attack. It was not a benign attack. But I remember at some point, after several hours of treating this horde of people, coming out of the room to see, wow, we must be getting overwhelmed, and seeing 3 other doctors lined up at the entranceway waving people in. So my lesson there was that everybody likes to be at the center of the action during a disaster or during a crisis, but you need to be very disciplined about making sure people spread out, that you allocate people to where they need to be, and that there needs to be very firm leadership, because people's instincts during a disaster or during a crisis don't always serve them well. Again, it's fairly obvious that that's the case, that you need firm leadership, but it's surprising how tunnel vision people get when something like this happens. So on 9/11, fast forward, so from 1993, again, I lived in France for 5 years. I came back to the city in 99. Then I worked at the hospital that I became permanently the director at, in Lower Manhattan, which St. Vincent's is about 2 kilometers north of the towers. My base hospital, the one that I was in 9/11, is about 400 meters maybe away from the towers, about 5 city blocks. So on 9/11, I was the only attending physician. I was the only senior doctor on duty in the ER. We had house staff, like interns and residents, and the usual staff of an ER. And it was a beautiful morning. Would you like me to describe 9/11, or do you have questions in the meantime?
I have a question in the meantime. We will definitely go back to 9/11, but before that, I also understand you were before that working in a war zone in Nicaragua. Is that true?
That is true. So
yeah, so you're used to working in such extreme environment.
Somewhat, yes. So Nicaragua, when I finished my residency in 1986, I did 3 years training as a family physician. My family is Nicaraguan. My father is Nicaraguan, and my mother's father is Nicaraguan. So mathematically, I'm 3/4 Nicaraguan, whatever that's worth. So I was always very interested in what was happening in Nicaragua. And when the Sandinista revolution happened in '79, I was following it very closely and had relatives there. So when I became a fully trained physician, I went down to work in the war zone. At that point, there was a pretty nasty war going on. The United States was trying to oust the Sandinistas, and so there was a counter-revolution, very bloody, very vicious. And I worked up north in that war zone. And that had many difficulties, obviously, but it also taught me how when you're really on a crusade. I mean, I was very, very passionate about it. I didn't work for the Sandinistas per se. I just worked at a hospital. They assigned me to a rural hospital that needed more leadership. It was being run by interns, and I was, technically a senior to them. Um, but when you're really gung ho about something, and I was very full of fire and brimstone to make, to save lives because I felt my government was taking lives by funding the counter-revolution. I was probably too disciplinary. I was probably too rigid. I expected these Nicaraguan interns to be as disciplined or as responsive to authority as I had been in my training. And so I think I became too heavy-handed. Again, we had some wonderful cases, but we also made some mistakes. And I think part of my mistakes there were that I was, instead of seeing how far I could get them, I expected them to meet a standard that I thought was appropriate, not that met the conditions that I was working in. And so there was some resentment on their part, and we didn't have the best relationship all the time. And so working in a war zone, again, where the chips are really, the stakes are very high, we saw a lot of battle casualties and a lot of people stepping on mines and gunfights nearby. I was never directly threatened. I was never in danger, but we were right on the edges of this. But it just go. I thought I was a native. I speak perfect Spanish. I grew up in Puerto Rico, so I have no accent. And so I thought, A, I'm a well-trained physician. B, I'm a Nicaraguan, and C, I speak the language fluently. So I don't have a cultural barrier to how I deal with this situation. And I think that was a mistake. I think no matter who you are in a new situation, you need to have the humility to sort of see how far you can take things or how much you can improve things without alienating the people you work with. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a friend. We recorded a couple of episodes with him. He's from Ukraine, and he's now working in war zone. So how does it feel to can you concentrate while working in such area?
I think so. I think what you at its best, you feel like at least you're being useful. And you also get so focused on what needs to be done and what damage is being done to the people around you that your only instinct is to try to fix it, is to try to bring people back and heal them. On the one hand, it's almost an honor to be able to do that. I mean, I'm sure in Ukraine it's terrifying. You never know if a drone is going to hit you. Nicaragua, I think a lot safer than a doctor in Ukraine was, even though I was near the war zone. You stop thinking about yourself a little bit just because you see so much that needs to be done around you.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a stupid question about the place you grew up in Puerto Rico?
Sure.
I just saw that it was announced that during the next Super Bowl halftime show, there will be Bad Bunny from Puerto Rico.
Yep.
I know they have songs. They have no songs in English. Do you think that's a political message or a sign of gratitude towards innovation in mainstream music?
Boy, that's a great. You framed the question perfectly. I mean, he is the most popular musician in the world, as far as I think by numbers or by hits or by sales. But it is daring for the National Football League, which is very conservative and very, mostly right-wing owners. Bad Bunny has made very clear he's not very pro-American and he's resentful of what has happened in Puerto Rico, and he only sings in Spanish. Yeah. I think it's brave, and I think but it's also acknowledging that this is where youth is. This is where music is. Just that's the world. So accept it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great choice actually. So I'm really looking forward.
His lyrics are
Um,
very slangy. It's very a little, rappy, streety. It's very authentically Puerto Rican. Yes. Anyway,
mm.
we'll see.
There's going to be a great party.
Yeah,
But let's get back to 9/11.
sure.
So please go ahead and share your experiences. What was it like at that time for just from your perspective?
Sure. I think one thing about the background to this is that we had the 1993 attack as a template. Afterwards, there was a big improvement in disaster preparedness and disaster training, both in the towers themselves, where they widened staircases, they trained people on evacuation. And the miracle of 9/11, aside from what we did, the towers themselves, that 99% of the people below the impacts of the planes escaped those towers. So it speaks to how well they prepared in advance just in the towers, forget the medical response. Um, so for us, the same thing happened. We would do drills in the hospital to understand how do you manage large numbers of patients all at once, many of whom would be very badly injured. So as it happened again, I was on duty in July when we had a full-scale drill on this. And so you bring in people dressed up as if they have cat injuries, and it's called moulage. And so they have bloody bandages, they're screaming, they're trying to mimic what happens in a real disaster. And I remember thinking, where do I put all these people and how do I assign people to them right away? Again, we're a small ER. We saw maybe at the time 90 patients a day. So, not a high volume place, pretty small. So 9/11 was a very quiet morning. And I remember, the irony was that I was in the bathroom, and suddenly there was this overhead page saying respiratory therapy to the emergency department. And I thought, well, I'm the only attending physician here. Only I can call that. So I was puzzled. So I, kind of got myself together and was stumbling out of the bathroom. And a nurse was running through the ER saying an American Airlines plane hit the towers. We knew it was an airliner because we had the police. One of our paramedics heard from a police radio that it was not a small plane. It was a large plane that hit the tower. So we knew immediately that it was going to be a very large event. So I went running around. We're a 7-minute walk from the towers, and so I raced around the ER with our nurses and our docs, just trying to gather supplies, get everything visible, set up. We knew we had, again, at most 10 minutes, and so we did that as fast as we could, and then waited for a beat, and then suddenly an avalanche of patients ran in. It was like was one of those movies where you see a sudden stampede of people rounding the corner, just flooding into your emergency department. And the first patient we saw had her lower leg sheared off, almost like something had hit her that basically had flayed open the muscles on the backs of her legs. So it's a shocking injury right off the bat. There was a weird myth about 9/11 that the hospitals were empty and that you either died or you walked away. And of course, that was not true because the media uptown saw empty hospitals, but the hospitals downtown obviously had a completely different event. But so right away, I was in charge. So the nurse manager was inside the ER and I was outside trying to triage and bring the patients in. So two things happened. One is immediately with this first patient that we saw who was so horrendously injured, the first surgeon that came next to me, he had a British accent, just funny. He goes, oh, it's a disaster and we have to, amputate right away. We don't know what's coming next. So he was being, sort of in disaster mode. But then this was a surgeon who had come from another hospital nearby. And then two of our surgeons, an orthopedist and a plastic surgeon, came up and said, they looked at her for a minute and they thought about it and they said, let's take her to the operating room and see if we can salvage her legs. And so there was this interesting contrast between disaster mode, be very quick and be very definitive, versus take your time and think this through and make sure you're giving this patient the best care possible. And the happy ending to that story is they did save her legs and she did survive. But in the meantime, I had to manage these hundreds of patients coming in. And what I discovered was you're supposed to tie tags around their necks. You're supposed to write, critical or medium or whatever. And we had these tie tags, which was very primitive. And it took too long to write on the tags. By the time I was writing one tag, 10 more people were going through. But I had young residents, I had interns and residents that knew me. Again, it was a small hospital, so we all knew each other well. There was no ambiguity about who was in charge. So they clustered around me, and I would assign a young doctor to each one of these patients as they came in and said, take them back to the critical area or take them back to the non-critical area. And that worked really well because these young doctors were very good at picking up what was wrong with the patients as they transported them, because they were dust covered. They were hard to diagnose immediately as they came in. I would make my best guess, but then these young doctors would improve on that. But as more people came in, again, there were horrendous burns because the jet fuel was going down the elevator shafts and blowing out in the lobbies and literally frying people. And trauma from debris falling onto people on the streets below. So a lot of head injuries. But as more people came in, a second ER attending, when people heard, they all came into the hospital. People on the night shift had turned around and come back into the hospital. So the staff rallying together was really impressive. Nobody ran in fear. All they wanted to do, to your point about what it's like in a war zone, their only instinct was to come back and help.
In such situations,
it seems to be a deep-seated human reflex to just helping as opposed to making yourself safe. I'm sure it's not 100%, but it's pretty remarkable. But one other interesting lesson was we had a cafeteria next to the ton of space, and so we were rapidly filling up, and we would bring patients into the next open area, which was the cafeteria. But I was the only doctor in the ER. I mean, we had surgeons coming down, we had other attendings in the hospital, and it wasn't like I was the only doctor, but I was the only one kind of organizing the ER. And so it kind of got out of my own hands. The second ER attending, a colleague who I knew very well, he came in and I said, you go back to the cafeteria. So people were milling around, there were patients, there were doctors, trying to get organized. And he stood up on a chair with the nurse and said, I'm Dr. Azar, I'm in charge, here's how it's going to be. And immediately said, okay, that's the asthma area, that's the suture area. And you're dealing with well-trained professionals. All you have to do is tell them where to go and what to do, and they'll immediately self-organize. But you need that overlaying direction. And so my takeaway from 9/11 that day was I ended up using my index finger a lot. I would point to people and deliberately say, you go here and take care of this, and make it as clear as I could that I didn't want anybody clustering the way I had seen in 1993, that people needed clear direction, but once they had that clear direction, they functioned incredibly well. The other thing you see is how people, when there's a crisis, how people rise to the occasion. It's stunning. We had trauma rooms where we would have very, very sick patients with multiple injuries, and everyone's throwing things around and it's bloody, and you're cutting airways, and you're doing surgical procedures, and then you're taking patients into the emergency, up to the operating room, but then you need the next patient to come in. And I remember looking at one of the rooms, and it was a bloody, just kind of a disaster. And one of the housekeeping people came up to me and I said, oh my God, I need this. Then he says, I got you, doc. And 5 minutes later, the thing was pristine. The people will jump into those situations and go at speeds that you can't imagine, that you almost don't even have to direct them because they know what to do. They're hunting for what they can do that makes themselves useful. So that was very heartening to see how everybody rose to the occasion. My big fear on 9/11 was that we would miss somebody, that amid the chaos and amid the dust, because after about 45 minutes to the first hour, when the towers came down, then there was this huge dust cloud. I'm sure you've seen the pictures.
Mm.
But I was outside triaging, and suddenly I heard this enormous explosion. I didn't know what it was because my angle of vision was just off the towers. I was looking in the other direction. I thought they were attacking more, and so the trauma of thinking, oh, they're attacking more buildings, stunned me. But then this dust cloud came barreling down the street and completely engulfed us. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So people were dealing with that. So patients coming in through that dust cloud were trying to escape the dust cloud, and so the hospital opened up. They were pounding on the windows to try to get in to escape that choking dust.
How did your colleagues react in times of uncertainty and fear?
Yeah, and so I would, it's all, everybody has their own piece of it. I deliberately was not looking at the towers while I was doing all this. I didn't want to be distracted. But the other side of the hospital had open, we had a very clear view of the towers, and there were conferences going on, and many people on the floors of the hospital could see out those windows, and people were jumping. It was horrendous that because of the fires in the tower, people basically chose between the fire and just jumping. So that trauma of seeing people jumping off the towers, terrified many staff, but they never stopped. They processed that somehow because there was too much to do at the time. I think that has been a lingering trauma for them, and I'm glad I didn't see that. But nobody stopped, nobody left, nobody panicked, and also you sort of say, I have nowhere to go. Where am I going to go? Whatever happens, I'm here, and I can't. I might as well function. But also there was a lot of trust that we all knew that we all had each other's backs, and that was a very big deal because because we were a small hospital and had worked together for a number of years. There was no doubt that you could turn around and your colleague would be doing even more than you were doing. You're almost too busy to be scared. And when that cloud hit, you can't keep the doors closed. People are desperate to get inside. But then you're thinking, oh, we're going to contaminate the hospital. We're going to have all this awful dust come into the hospital. So the nurse manager, who was a very, very dear buddy, she got two hard hats, two construction guys, to rig up our doors so that they would be like an airlock, so you could come in and not contaminate the hospital. So people were improvising every step of the way. We lost phone connections, we lost water. Our ventilation systems started going out, so we were really debating whether to close the hospital, but we didn't. We could still function. But getting back to the point of missing somebody, so it turns out as well, again, I pieced this together afterwards. I tried hard to understand the full extent of what everyone had been doing. And I had sort of this illusion that I could keep an eye on everything and make sure we weren't missing anyone. But like the assistant chair of surgery, she made it her business to walk around the ER and make sure no one was missed, that people were taking it on themselves and seeing what needed to be done. And she found a gentleman who was badly injured, who we had overlooked, and brought him immediately to be treated. But in retrospect, and this is why I can sleep at night, is that we didn't miss anybody that I know of, that no badly injured patient lacked the care that they needed, which just speaks to how tightly everybody was working together.
Mm-hmm. And in such situation of crisis, what works best? That you know exactly all the procedures, how to react, or just some logic works in such case?
I think it's practice. I think whatever, as I mentioned, the drills that we had and the practice sessions that we had, even if whatever crisis occurs is different than what you practice for, how you react, you need to understand what resources you have and how to use them and how to improvise. And even if you're doing that for fake, just as a drill, it expands your thinking on that question. And so it's not like you're making it up as you go along the first time. And most of the staff, they'd already been getting extra training in disaster management and basically the hierarchy of, who's in charge, who gives direction, who is the next level, how do you spread out, how do you function logically and not cluster and get inefficient or hit roadblocks that, who's in charge of bringing supplies. You have to think of what you're going to need very quickly and where those things are. And so you don't want to be not having the key to the cabinet that has your walkie-talkies in it, kind of thing. And so you need to walk through some very basic things. Does that answer your question, Yanis, sort of?
Yeah, certainly. Does it also teach how the teams should be built? I mean, you had to react without full information, make rapid decisions, adapt continuously. So,
I think you have a constant feedback loop. And so the thing we could have done better was we didn't have great communications. Our walkie-talkies weren't powerful enough and the phones all go out. So you have to assume that your communication systems will go down. And what do you do when you don't? Because we all didn't have cell phones at the time. This was 2001. What's your fallback plan? Do you have runners? Do you have people simply taking messages to each other? And what I would do is I would go back and consult with Mary. Like we would be constantly going back and forth, updating each other of what we needed to do, who needed to go where. When more doctors came in, I remember once yet another ER attending came in. We had about 10 full-time doctors in the ER at that time. So, they kept coming in. So one came in and I made rounds with him again. And I said, I saw a patient that I thought might not have a doctor. I said, you need to go there. And he wanted to be where the action was. And I said, no, you're going here, and he obeyed me, but because he knew I was the boss. But that kind of re-look, you have to constantly be rechecking and it's like a radar screen. You have to be constantly going around and making sure you're meeting all the needs that are arising, that you're understanding how your systems are failing, because most of our systems failed. We would use runners to get people upstairs. Usually there's a lot of paging and consulting, and as we were bringing patients into the emergency room, we would simply take them upstairs, and the doctors and the nurses who handled the inpatient floors simply took them. But we couldn't tell them in advance as much as we wanted. You just had to do physical one-on-one. For charts, we would write on the sheets. We would write the patient's history on the sheet next to them. We had no electronic record, so you're always improvising. But you need that kind of supple leadership. You can't have silos, and you can't have jurisdictions that are competing, like, no, wait, this is my job, and no, this is my job. Once you get that kind of friction between leaders or friction between sections of your response, that's a bad thing. That will hamper your response. And that can be hard, when you have bureaucracies that are competing with each other. That, like, for instance, one of the terrible lessons of 9/11 was how in New York City, the fire department and the police department did not talk to each other. And so as the 320 firefighters died in the towers trying to rescue people. It's a huge casualty list. But police helicopters were overhead watching the tower, seeing the towers start to sway, start to look unstable. But there was no direct communication between the police department and the fire department. So they couldn't warn the fire department to get out of the towers. The other reason for that is because Rudy Giuliani, as the mayor, had put the command center for the city, the Office of Emergency Management, across the street from the North Tower of the World Trade Center in 1997. So he built it after 93, knowing the tower was already a target. So when the North Tower was hit, it took out, the debris fell on the command center and destroyed the command center. So Giuliani and the leadership had to flee, which meant that was the only connection between the fire department and the police department. So you could argue that that siloing, that lack of coordination between the two cost the lives of many firefighters. But just goes, again, if you don't have a fluid command structure where everybody can talk to everybody and organize with each other, that's the kind of thing that'll happen. It's tragic. I mean, this is not a well-known story about 9/11 because I think it was too traumatic almost even to examine the errors that were made, but it's a fact.
Any other lessons you have filtered for yourself in the aftermath of 9/11?
One of the more emotionally important things was almost like that first surgeon who wanted to go really quickly and amputate the young woman's legs. When things are happening so quickly and I'm sorry about that. All you want to do is treat as fast as possible because patients are coming very quickly. My regret on 9/11 is that I didn't assign people to hold patients' hands. You always there's usually more people than you know what to do with. Nurses and doctors and outside people come in to help when there's a disaster like that. And it would have been a good idea on my part to assign every patient somebody to just sit with them and hold their hand. That the emotional connection between doctors and nurses and physicians' assistants and patients gets broken in a way because we're all going so fast. And in the aftermath of 9/11, I'm sure this is true of any other crisis, that emotional connection to the people that you were with, to the patients you treated, or everybody who was there is really important, because otherwise you feel empty in a way, that you feel anonymous. It's too anonymous. It's not, the human connection is really important. And so for me, what happened, we made contact with a family of a patient that we had who was badly injured. We shipped him up to NYU about 2 weeks later because he'd suffered a spinal injury, he had burns, he had a crushed chest, he was very badly injured, but he was conscious. And so his family was in Boston. So they came down to New York, and after several weeks, a friend at NYU said, "Hey, we can go meet him." And I was sort of desperate to make contact with the patients that I had treated. And we went up to see them, and I expected his wife, who had been there sleeping in the hospital for 2 or 3 weeks, to be a haggard wreck. And she was full of love. All she could say was, "That must have been a terrible day for you guys." And my buddy and I, who's a cardiologist, were like, a bad day for us. Your husband was almost killed. But that kind of compassion and love and connection is something very deep that happens in crises like this. That in a way you strip away all the barriers between human beings and you're all together in a way that you never really are in any other situation. And she kind of kept my own sanity. She was so full of generosity, and again, I couldn't believe that she was worried about us when her husband was in the ICU and he eventually died 3 months to the day after 9/11. But that openness of spirit, that largeness of spirit that happens, is something you really have to nurture when these kind of things happen.
He was from the tax authorities, right?
Exactly. Yeah, he was in town. He worked for the IRS, for the tax IRS, and was just in town for a business meeting and happened to be walking outside the towers, and just had unbelievably bad luck, but also an unbelievably amazing human.
Yeah, we sometimes forget that for most we are all human beings, right? So about this emotional attachment you mentioned, I also saw that you recalled the wonderful example that in France after 9/11 someone wrote that we are all Americans now.
Yeah.
Why do you think this feeling of people being united comes only in the moment of crisis?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I spent the night. We all spent the night after 9/11, and we went down to the site to try to rescue anyone who was trapped in the rubble, and there was a transit officer, um, Oliver Stone, made a movie about that. It was called 9/11, and we saw the chaos of people trying to organize and trying to rescue at the time. Um, but I'm sorry, Yanis. Tell me your question again. I'm sorry.
I mean, why is
Oh
this?
yeah.
Why do you think this
So
feeling? Yeah.
right. So that night we spent the night trying to do that, and we were all busy until the next day. And when I finally went home, I hadn't been watching TV or anything. So Lower Manhattan felt like a little cocoon because the power went out because of the collapse of the command center opposite the North Tower. By another domino coincidence, it took out the power and the telephone lines in Lower Manhattan. So Lower Manhattan was completely blacked out for a week because of Giuliani's, poor planning. Anyway, so we felt completely cut off and isolated, even though the whole world was looking at Lower Manhattan. It was a very bizarre paradox. So by the time I got home later that evening and was watching the news, it was the first time I saw the candlelight vigils around the world, and the headline in Le Monde that Nous sommes tous des Américains. And that was the first time I cried. I was, the overwhelming love and support from around the world was staggering and so moving. But it was so, it was so ironic that amazing openness of spirit, because even in New York City, people in the subway started being nicer to each other. There was this kind of compassion epidemic of everybody looking out for each other, of suddenly understanding their own mortality. And as a hardened New Yorker, I'm a New Yorker, that change in attitude was really palpable. But then, the unfortunate thing was then again, I'll get a little political, that, then we went to war in Iraq and blew it. We used all that goodwill and all that generosity from around the world and misused it. And instead of trying to build a new world based on that feeling of solidarity and all of us in it together, we went in the wrong direction. And I think, to me, that's the tragedy of 9/11, is that it opened a space in human consciousness or in human solidarity that then was squandered.
Yeah, that's a pity. Um, After 9/11 came economic crash, then COVID, then Ukrainian war. People are worried about global warming and AI. Do you feel that we are more and more living in constant crisis situation? And if so, how to preserve some
Yeah.
mental health or resilience?
I think what makes you grounded and maybe makes you human is serving in some way. That whether every country should institute some kind of program for its young people, that they need to serve a year or two someplace, that not in the military, but in healthcare or service to communities or something, where you see something not your own environment, or even travel abroad. I had a very strong feeling after 9/11 that if it were up to me, I would use all those billions of dollars we wasted on Iraq and Afghanistan to send Americans abroad, to have American students go around the world and learn about the world and learn how to try to work with other people in other countries to make a better world. That kind of interchange and that kind of human contact, I think, is the only thing that's going to get us away from demonizing each other and getting wrapped up in ideology. I mean, on 9/11, I remember, again, this is a very cliched feeling. I mean, the poets in World War I had exactly this sentiment, but when you see how horrendously injured, because 9/11 was about young people. Our casualties were all workers in their 30s and 20s and 30s and 40s. It was all young people who had been perfectly healthy until catastrophe hit. And so the tragedy of that was so overwhelming that you feel, what ideology could possibly justify this? What ideas are more valuable than this young woman I'm seeing who's been burned from head to toe. It doesn't compute. But you have to somehow foment that human connection.
That's quite corresponds to what I've heard quite recently in one business conference where somebody said that if two departments of the same firm do not cooperate, then you just need to exchange people between the departments and
Yeah,
see how they feel in the
absolutely.
other department.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens in hospitals too. Emergency departments and internal medicine, the people that admit patients are always fighting. We always think that the other side is lazy and they're all stupid. But once you exchange, once you see it from the other side, then it changes. It seems really basic.
Hmm. I just returned last week from Nordic Business Forum in Helsinki, in Finland.
Oh, wow.
I heard a wonderful experience that emergency room doctors learned from Formula One teams
Oh,
how
really?
to act in more coordinated manner in order to save more lives. So they basically took how they change tires for
Oh, wow.
cars in order to act quickly in a more coordinated manner in the emergency room. Uh, do you see some examples how businesses could learn from doctors?
Ooh. So one thing that I did that I was pretty adamant about, two things that I think were good moves that I made, I think. One was, so when a critical patient comes in, you're supposed to be an ER doctor who knows everything and is omnipotent, but it's very hard to do it by yourself. Patient, you have to talk to the family, you have to make phone calls, you have to put in IVs, but you don't want to look weak. So you don't want to call for help because then you're weak. So I made it the rule when I was the director that there had to be two attendings. So we had a system in our ER where we assigned the nurses would assign the patients to the doctors as they came in. So it wasn't up to you. You couldn't cherry pick. But I made it mandatory that they would assign a second attending. So you got the help even if you didn't want it. And that was, I think, very effective because then if you didn't need it, you could say, look, I'm good. This is not that complicated. No big deal. But many times you did need it and you wouldn't have asked for it otherwise. The other thing I think that I was very passionate about was quick feedback loops. So in medicine, I'm sorry, you have a culture of never speak about your mistakes. When there are mistakes, you're going to get sued. It's shameful. And I would make it my business when you do morning rounds every day, if we'd had a recent mistake or something that could have been done better, I would share that with the staff. I'd say, look, we had a stroke that came in yesterday. It was kind of subtle. The man's hand was weak, but remember when a patient has any complaint about weakness anywhere, to consider a possible stroke. Just simple, quick rules, but very much your own environment. What is happening in my environment that we seem to be not being optimal at? Not theoretical of communicate better or have clear hierarchies or protocols. This is what happened to us yesterday and learned from it. And so I think those two initiatives, I think, helped a lot in our department, and I think they could be applied to a business world of that kind of transparency and feedback loop, because people want to know what's happening, what's going on, what is going well, what isn't going well. Share the enterprise's culture and share the news of where we are today, and I think that would help a lot. I understand there are needs for confidentiality sometimes, but I think we could be a lot more open than we are.
And I understand you're retired now. And
Yeah.
what about your plans? Do you plan to write a book about leadership in the times of crisis, or some other plans?
So I am writing a book, and it's trying to take on the notion of that omerta of silence about mistakes, that we're all trying to bury mistakes and not talk about them. So the book is based around my own mistakes. I'm trying to see
Mm.
that by describing my own mistakes and why I made them, it might help young doctors anticipate them and avoid them. That in many ways, there's a lot of theoretical writing about medical mistakes and there's a lot of research about it, but it never gets into the nitty gritty. It never gets into the why did this good doctor choose left instead of right and make a mistake? What was it that they were seeing? What was it that I need to know to avoid it? And so when I was an intern, I asked my residency director, can you tell me about the mistakes you've made so I won't repeat them? And he said, I can't tell you because I'm afraid what you'd think of me. And so I'm going to try to not worry about what they'll think of me.
Oh, that's great. I think many listeners will be looking forward to
Yeah.
have your book and read it. As our podcast is called Tech Stories, do you have something you see in the tax system that can be improved from your perspective?
Ooh, in the American tax system,
Yeah.
I think fairness. I think one of the big loopholes in the American tax system is, hedge fund managers, and maybe hedge fund listeners might not agree with this, have a much lower tax rate because it's considered capital gains. So wealthy taxpayers get a very nice tax reduction because of this loophole, and I think that that's not fair. I think that the French Revolution happened because the aristocrats were not paying taxes, partly. Only the peasants paid taxes. The aristocrats and the church paid nothing, which is shocking. And I think in the United States, there is too much gaming of that. I don't mean to soak the rich. I just think it should be fair across the board, that rich people shouldn't pay a lower rate than middle class people. And that happens too much with us, I think. Especially, it's called the carried interest. I don't know why I obsess about this, but I've read a lot about it, and the carried interest loophole seems immoral.
Right. Great insights, Tony, and I truly appreciate your time. And my last question is to the same to all my guests about your version of meaning of life. What would you reply to that?
Ooh. I think the most fulfilled I've been, besides my family, which is who I adore and would do anything for. I have 3 children, and again, I adore them all, and my wife is fantastic. She stood by me amazingly during COVID when I was pretty scared because I'm the wrong age and the wrong sex. I think for me, the epiphany of my career, the meaning of life, was being able to support and train doctors and nurses to take better care of our patients. That that there was a time when I had built a team of people that really appreciated each other, that learned from each other, and that were all working together. And I thought bringing excellent care to all the patients that we had. So that combination of not just taking care of patients, but maybe broadening it out to having a team that took care of patients and expanded that caring was very fulfilling.
Right. Fantastic. Tony, I truly appreciate your time and thanks indeed for sharing your story and thanks for all your help here to so many people and so many lives. So truly appreciate your time and
Uh,
effort.
great to meet you, Janice, and great questions. You have a great podcast.